Welcome to the 55th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Burwell Park, cottage. I moved in the day before my 20th birthday. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, the house parents, were retired missionaries, this their first Bernardo posting. They seemed friendly and gave me a warm reception. The cottage beside Mossford School, where children's laughter reached my ears from the playground, was newly decorated, but empty and quiet, as no children were assigned to it yet. The next day, the Wilsons cheerfully sang "Happy Birthday to You" in the boiler room, the warmest room in the chilly house, and presented me with a box of chocolates. Still, by the time I made my way up to my room on that second night, I felt strangely out of touch with reality. In the unfamiliar bed, I shivered under the thin blanket. The bare walls stretched out. The single bed grew to an enormous size, and my minuscule body lay in it, lost and alone. The following days were full of new things to learn, different ways of doing things. Very little matched the tuition that had been drummed into me over the past 8 weeks of training. House parents, for the most part, were free to run their cottages how they liked. The safe rules that previously had kept me grounded ran amok. Lost in a turmoil of uselessness, unable to contribute to the daily running of things. 5 days after I moved in, our first child arrived, 5 years old, scared and uncooperative. It was the popular celebration Guy Fawkes Day, and a huge bonfire burned on the largest of the 3 greens. After my failure to entice the little boy with a boiled egg for tea, I was instructed to take him to see the fireworks. Holding firmly onto his hand, we blindly groped through the dark towards the glow of the fire, and without any warning, he sensed the chance to flee, slipped out of my grasp, and was gone. I looked everywhere for him, but gave up and reported him missing. Mrs. Wilson was furious. "Can't you keep hold of one small child?" she yelled, and promptly sent her husband outside to search for him. He returned with the boy, and instead of the boy getting into trouble, I suffered the disgrace. Mrs. Wilson called him God's little gift from heaven. I had different words in mind. In rapid succession, more little gifts from heaven arrived, wrenched from their parents, deemed unfit to care for them. The bereft children didn't understand or appreciate that they were being rescued from less than perfect circumstances. They cried for their mothers every night. My job was to comfort them. I did not do it well. After I bathed the children each evening, the Wilsons received them in the front sitting room, warmed by glowing coals in the fireplace. They sat with them and fussed over them. My entrance was denied, even though the room was officially designated a staff room. I shivered outside the closed door in the cold hallway until they called me to take the children upstairs to bed. Afterwards, with their cries ringing in my ears, I took to my lonely bed, more miserable than ever. Mealtimes became a particular frustration. Mr. Wilson presided at the head of the long table, around which 8 children of varying ages now sat in enforced silence. He insisted on each child finishing every scrap of food on their plates before being dismissed. The rule applied to me too, and as the fatty portions of meat on my plate remained uneaten, I sat at the table well into the evening as punishment. Held hostage, my father's wrath resurrected in the person of Mr. Wilson. I half expected a stick to be whipped out from the sideboard and whacked down on my hands like my dad did at Mildenhall when he was so stressed out about his job. "You're worse than the children," Mr. Wilson said to me in front of them, giving them ammunition with which to ignore my requests for obedience. I was only released to perform the bedtime routine. More and more I lost all control of them and resorted to tactics that betrayed my own weaknesses. The Wilsons stated that if a child's underwear was soiled at the end of the day, that child was denied a bowl of cereal at bedtime. Annoyed and frustrated at their constant bad behavior and my increasing anxiety, made worse with the accusing voices in my head, I found myself maliciously denying them the treat, even if the underwear showed barely a stain. So cruel of me to inflict power over such unfortunate innocents. I became a monster, only adding more grief to their sad state of affairs. I despised myself for not being able to show them love. On one day off midweek, not able to see Brian, I took off on the tube to Oxford Circus and wandered around the streets for 5 lonely, desperate hours, all by myself. My lowest point since entering the village home. I browsed the shops simply to be amongst people. I would have gone with any stranger, if any had approached me. But thankfully, no one took advantage of my vulnerable state. So much for my mother's warning about pickpockets lying in wait for me on every corner. I wrote to Brian about my situation. He must have found it hard to imagine the Wilsons' behavior, as they'd been extremely pleasant towards him. Their stories of missionary life he'd found interesting and informative. In a moment of weakness, I shared with my house parents a little of my insecure upbringing and how it sometimes affected me negatively. Mr. Wilson gave me a supposed foolproof Christian method of dealing with those painful memories. "Imagine putting all your past into a large sack," he firmly advised me. "Dig an imaginary hole at the base of a tree. Throw the sack in the hole, cover it up with dirt, and walk away. That'll take care of your problems." Perfect. I followed his instructions, but the sack and its contents wouldn't stay buried. Like a zombie, it came back to life, dragging its bulky shape out of the hole to torment me. In mid-December one evening, I ended up on Queen Victoria House's doorstep, where the head tutor opened the door and let me inside. Choking back the tears, I told her I couldn't work for the Wilsons any longer. After I explained everything, whether she believed me or not, she agreed to move me somewhere else, but until then, I'd have to go back. She handed me a sealed envelope containing a letter to Colonel Atkins, the person in charge of the village home's affairs. I could hand it to him if things became unbearable before my transfer. Back at the cottage, I let myself in and crept upstairs to bed. In the morning, the atmosphere breathed ice. The Wilsons had been contacted, and they let me know how displeased they were with my betrayal. I kept silent and bided my time, knowing I would soon be out of there. A message came that I had a place in Curling Cottage, next door, with an apology that I couldn't be farther away from the source of my troubles. I'll have to make the best of the fact that I'll be walking along the same pathway as the Wilsons to church on Sunday mornings and seeing them all the time. At least I won't be living with them. I never knew the contents of the sealed envelope. Fearful of what might be written about my state of mind, I threw it away unopened in the dustbin. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.